Okay, well, welcome everyone to a very special edition of our IMC VMC Club. We have the privilege this evening of having our CFII extraordinaire, Scott Thompson, who, for those who don't know, qualifies in EAA's criteria as a CFII, but he's a rare one because he's also an FAA career employee who's been an air traffic controller and spent what seemed like an awful lot of years flying the FAA Learjet flight check. He knows more about instrument approaches in general, but probably has visited more instrument approaches in the Western Hemisphere than anybody else that we know. So with that, I'd be happy to turn over the program to Scott.
Okay, good. Well, there's a lot of flight check pilots out there, and I did do both, actually, airborne flight inspection. I also did TURPS development for a number of years on the procedures themselves. When I first started with flight check, the procedure specialists also worked in the local office, and we did, like, I was responsible with somebody else for all the California procedures. So, I had a lot of experience doing that, and then they split the offices out, and then I started doing just purely flight inspection. But this topic I find interesting because I think there's some holes in the knowledge base out there about this subject, about what's happening between the MDA and the runway. This whole idea started about a month ago when a retired airline pilot who's currently flying 135 operations asked me about an approach that he'd flown at night down in the south, and it was there was no Vasties or Pappies on the approach, and he had flown the approach I think it was a light jet, and when they were on short final, they saw something whiz by them very quickly, and then they felt a little bit of a bump, but they didn't think much about it until they landed and taxied in, and then they found tree branches in their landing gear. So they had skimmed across the top of some trees, and he didn't quite understand how that would happen on an instrument approach. And then just yesterday, I don't know how many of you if anybody saw the Juan Brown discussion about the NTSB report that just came out on the Cessna 208 accident that happened in April of 2022, where a pilot flew into a stack that was short of the runway. So I thought this would be appropriate, and I'm going to try to keep it to 30 minutes, but who knows where we'll end up here. So this discussion is only about the non-precision approaches. A lot of the criteria also applies to precision approaches, but then there's added protection on precision approaches that we're not going to talk about here. So this is only about non-precision, which for those VFR pilots is an approach where you don't have vertical guidance. You're just given altitudes to fly to a minimum descent altitude, and then from there you see the runway or you don't, and then you decide at that point whether you're going to fly it or not, land or not. So the segment of the approach we're talking about is what's called the visual portion of the final approach segment. And the simple definition of that is the visual portion begins when a pilot descends below the MDA and ends at the runway threshold. So it's that part of the approach where you're expected to fly visually. And this is from the AIM Aeronautical Information Manual that talks about exactly what I just said. But a visual, and I'm going to read this because this is important, visual segment obstruction evaluation is accomplished during procedure design and all instrument approach procedures. Obstacles, both lighted and unlighted, are allowed to penetrate the visual segment obstacle identification surfaces. Identified obstacle penetrations may cause restrictions to instrument approach operations, which may include an increased approach visibility requirement, not publishing a visual descent point, and or prohibiting a night instrument operations to the runway. There is no implicit obstacle protection from the MDA to the touchdown point. Accordingly, it is the responsibility of the pilot to visually acquire and avoid obstacles below the MDA during transition to landing. So the prior definition referred to the visual descent point. So for those who are not really familiar with it, it's a symbol on the profile view of the approach, symbolized with a V, that's usually, it always is between the step down fix, if there is one, or the final approach fix and the runway, because it's a calculation made by the procedure specialist that assumes the pilot will fly either a VGSI, a vertical guidance slope indicator, like PAPIs or VASIs to the runway, or if there's no VGSI, then a VDA, which we'll talk about. That's a vertical descent angle. So a VDP may not be published under certain circumstances, which may result in a destabilized descent between MDA and the runway touchdown point. And such circumstances include an obstacle penetrating the visual surface between the MDA and the runway threshold. Lack of distance measurement capability of the procedure design prevents the VDP to be identified. And the main thing the pilot needs to know about a VDP, as far as operationally, is once you pass the VDP at the MDA altitude, you're getting less and less likely to fly a stabilized approach. In most cases, the missed approach point on these non-precision approaches are the runway threshold. But if you cross a threshold at 500 or 600 feet, you're going to be really pressed to try to make a landing out of that approach. So the best way to fly an approach with a VDP is to start your descent if you have the runway in sight, and that way you have a normal descent to your runway touchdown. So here's some examples. This is at Humboldt County, and it's the left blue arrow shows the VDP, and the right blue arrow shows the missed approach point. So this is just, I mean, every instrument pilot who flies should know about this, but I'm just kind of doing this as a refresher because we talk about it a bit more later. So the actual visual area that is evaluated, it actually starts 200 feet from the runway threshold, and it extends either to the VDP, if there is one. For a circling runway, it extends to 10,000 feet. So it's well over, or nearly a mile, nearly two nautical miles, probably about 1 3/4 miles. And the width begins 200 feet each side of the runway center line and splays at 15 degrees to the full length. So this is the basic definition. However, this area is modified depending on the final approach course alignment and other things. But just for discussion purposes, this is the visual area that we're going to talk about. And there's two slopes that are evaluated by the TERP specialist when they draw this out. One is a 20-to-1 surface, and the other is a 34-to-1 surface. And those are what they're looking for penetrations. So a 34-to-1 obstacle penetration is equivalent, the slope is equivalent to 1.68 degrees. And if the procedure specialist identifies anything that penetrates that slope, whether it's a tree, terrain, a man-made object, then they have a restriction on the procedure. The visibility minimums have to be at least 3/4 of a mile or 4,000 foot RVR. Now the 20-to-1 slope is equivalent to 2.86 degrees, so it's quite a bit higher angle. And if you have a penetration of that, your visibility minimums cannot be less than 1 statute mile or 5,000 foot RVR. And in that case, they don't publish a VDP. There's no visual descent point published on the procedure. And if the obstacle penetration is unlit, like a tower, that runway is then made not authorized at night for instrument approaches. But in some circumstances, if there's a VGSI installed on the runway and it meets other criteria, then that might not be required. You might have the procedure authorized at night if you have a VGSI that qualifies. So the note on the procedure that you're going to see is it's going to be stated straight in runway XX at night, operational VGSI required, remain on or above the VGSI glide path until threshold. And this is just to ensure the VGSI is checked for obstacles. So as long as you're flying above or on the VGSI glide path, you should be okay with any obstacles. When circling to runway XX at night, operational VGSI is required to remain on or above the VGSI glide slope until threshold. So it's essentially the same note, but in this case it's referring to circling approach, in which case you're going to fly visually to the runway, flying around the airport in some cases. But this is an important point to remember, that when circling, no matter where you are in the circling area, once you descend below the MDA, you are provided with no obstacle protection. You are flying visually. The VGSI is at most usable within 10 degrees of the runway center line. If you are descending below the circling MDA outside of that 10 degrees of center line, you are at the mercy of lit or unlit obstacles or terrain. There's no procedural obstacle protection provided. Nada. Zippo. So this comes into particular play when you're flying a night approach to an airport you're not familiar with. If you're relying on that VGSI to provide you with obstacle clearance, it will if you're within 10 degrees of the runway. But if you're outside of 10 degrees of the runway, you don't have anything. And once again, it is the responsibility of the pilot to visually acquire and avoid obstacles below the MDA during transition to landing. And this comes into play when you have a high height above airport, or HAA, in the circling minimums. So also from the AIM, which is derived from an FAR, pilots should remain at or above the circling altitude until the aircraft is continuously in a position from which a descent to a landing on the intended runway can be made at a normal rate of descent using normal maneuvers. This is textbook stuff. I'm sure it's on the IFR written exam. But the question is, if you're flying your downwind at the circling MDA, which happens to be 1,800 feet above the runway, when does the normal descent start for landing? Is that going to occur within 10 degrees of the runway? Most pilots would not want to turn base, come within 10 degrees of the runway, and then still be at 1,800 feet above the runway. So the inclination is to start your descent early in order to land on the runway. And I have an example here at Reno Stead. Now this airport has circling, and you'll notice in the top comment, on the left side is the FAA chart, on the right side is the Jepson chart. The same note, when VGSI is inoperative, circling is not authorized to runway 8 at night. Okay, that makes sense. But look at your HAA down here at the bottom. You have 1,790 foot HAA. And so essentially you're going to be flying a downwind here at 1,800 feet above the ground. And at some point, you're going to have to start a descent. So you really need to be careful. And you may find out when you're doing your pre-flight planning that you don't really want to fly this as a circling approach because you don't know what's out there. And if you look here, there is a 5,120 foot obstacle. Don't know what it is. It could be a tower. It could be terrain on the downwind. Now, granted, that's pretty low. That's near the ground, but there's other cases where you're going to have higher terrain. It won't be charted necessarily. You don't know what you're getting here for obstacles on your approach plates. And you see on the Jepson chart, it's not charted at all. So I would strongly recommend that anybody who's considering night circling to an airport that has a really high HAA to go to plan B on that. It's just not worth the risk, particularly if you're not familiar with the airport. If you're flying into Lincoln, you're comfortable with fairly low HAA and you're circling in an area you're familiar with, so that's one thing. But if you're flying into an airport with this terrain or unknown obstacles around it, you don't want to be circling at night below the MDA. So let's talk about that vertical descent angle a little bit. So vertical descent angle is only appropriate on non-precision approaches. So this is specifically what we're talking about here. And you'll notice in the red that the vertical descent angle on non-precision approaches, some approach procedures may provide a VDA as an aid in flying a stabilized approach without requiring its use in order to fly the procedure. This does not make the approach an APV procedure, which is a precision approach, since it must still be flown to an MDA and has not been evaluated with a glide path. So the VDA in its purest sense is an angle that will take you from the final approach fix or a step down fix on a stabilized approach to the runway threshold. And that's all it's giving you. That's it. There's no obstacle protection provided by VDA. So here's an example of VDAs at Fullerton. So on the left side, once again, the FAA chart, and on the right side, the Jepson presentation. So you have a 3.1 vertical descent angle. And for straight-in minimums, the VDA is mathematically calculated from the altitude of the FAF or the last SDF to the altitude of threshold. In this case, it's a 40-foot TCH at the runway. So they calculate mathematically the angle between those 2 points, and then it's published as a VDA. When the criteria is met, it is charted on the SIAP. The VDA establishes a stabilized approach in contrast with a dive and drive type non-precision approach. You'll see in some sources it's referred to as an advisory glide slope or an advisory glide path. That could be a misnomer. You're going to be careful with that word glide slope. A glide slope type symbol, VDA indication, will usually be provided to the pilot on his flight display that appears as a glide path. And some avionics systems will generate a glide path symbol even if the VDA does not meet criteria. It's a function of the avionics. It's doing the math itself, and it will, my understanding is some avionics systems will put a VDA presentation on your flight display, even if a VDA is not published on the procedure. So how do you tell if the 34-to-1 surface is clear? That's could be a quick clue for anybody as to whether you're going to have obstacle problems on an approach. So on an FAA chart, this little gray stipple is charted approaching the runway threshold. I don't know if you can see it very well on the screen, but it's a light gray stipple. It's very obscure, but that is the indication that you have a 34-to-1 surface that's clear. Now, Jepson charts, as far as I can determine, there is nothing that will tell you that same information. There's no notes, there's nothing, no symbology that I've found after doing some research that indicates that 34-to-1 is clear. So the only indication, positive indication you're going to have is this stipple being published on an FAA chart. If the 34-to-1 surface is not clear, then obviously there's no stipple on an FAA chart. And you'll have an actual note published on the Jepson chart here with this blue arrow on the right side. 34-to-1 is not clear. So if you ever wondered why they see that on an approach chart, that's why. On an FAA chart, it's not published in a note. It's just published because there's no stipple. On a Jepson chart, they make it clear 34-to-1 is not clear. But regardless of the visual segment obstacle evaluation, regardless of that, when the flight inspection is done by flight check, if it appears that flying the proposed VDA quote glide path has unsafe obstacles presented, then the proposed VDA will not be published, and instead a note will be added to the procedure, visual segment obstacles. And you'll see that on this approach. On both charts, we'll have it in the profile view. And this is a judgment call by the flight inspection pilot where they're flying the approach and could be close to the runway. There's a line of trees or a tower or something, and it may actually clear the obstacle surface is okay. It may be satisfactory for that, but in the pilot's judgment, it's not a safe situation to fly the VDA. You're coming too close to the obstacle, so they will not publish the VDA, and they'll add this note. Now notice though, on the FAA chart, it's not published. There's no VDA published. But if you look at the Jepson chart, it appears that this approach has a VDA. The symbology is not different. It still says 3.09 on the angle to the runway. they do have the visual segment note here, but this VDA, in some avionics, it may actually provide a VDA, and then you're flying a flight path that an FAA flight check pilot thought was not safe because there's some kind of obstacle out there that might get really close to you as you get close to the runway. So I don't know what avionics systems, I don't know, I'm not well versed in all the different types of avionics systems, but my understanding is, and this is true, this was true a few years ago, that even if the FAA says don't publish a VDA, the avionics will calculate one. So you need to be careful on that one. And this visual segment obstacle note is what you want to be looking for. That tells you something's going on with that approach that you need to be careful about between the final approach fix, between the MDA and the runway. So this is another gotcha here because there's inconsistencies, particularly on the FAA charts. And this is an example also at Fullerton. And there's no stipple on this chart showing 34-1 is clear. However, there's also nothing on the Jepson chart. So my guess is there's a 34-1 penetration here because there's no stipple. But the Jepson doesn't show that note. So I would not know from looking at this. If I were flying that as using an FAA plate, I would think, okay, I got a 34-1 penetration. But if I flew that on a Jepson chart, there's nothing to indicate that you do. So some inconsistencies out there you need to be careful with. So this brings us to the Burley accident. And I don't know, there's been a lot of information about that over the years. There was a lot of concern when this first occurred. It's at Burley Airport up in Idaho, and it was a Cessna 208 being flown on an RNAV approach and operating below MDA, and the pilot flew into a stack, and she was killed. So I took a look at this. Juan Brown had this video up yesterday, and it just came up. The NTSB just released the final approach. So I wanted to take a look at that because what we're talking about here demonstrates, it kind of pulls together all the things I was just talking about. So I have this crudely prepared graphic right here that I thought worth taking a look at. So this is the area on that approach between where the vertical descent angle crosses below the MDA. So this line across the top is the MDA, and all the yellow hatched areas, that's the visual area. That's where the pilot is expected to have visual contact with obstacles because he's operating below the MDA. If he doesn't see the runway at the VDA or shortly afterwards, he's probably going to fly a missed approach, which means he'll fly right at the MDA to the missed approach point and then start a climb. So that's safe. There's no obstacle issues with that. Your normal rock on this type of approach, required obstacle clearance, the height above obstacles in that segment is 250 feet. So you're going to get something close to that number if you're flying at MDA over all obstacles in the segment. Once you descend below the MDA, you're flying visually. Now, I identified the 20-1 and 34-1 slopes here, and this is the stack, right? Can you see my cursor? Is my cursor okay? Is everybody seeing it?
Okay. Yeah, we see it.
Yes.
Okay, so this right hand it represents the stack that she hit. Okay, so 34-1 and 20-1 slopes are presented here, and the 34-1 elevation is 4,213 feet. The obstacle is 4,256, so it's a 34-1 penetration. Okay, and the 20-1 surface is at 4,264. The obstacle's at 4,256. Well, there's actually another obstacle closer to the runway that actually is a 21 penetration. So whether this was identified as one or not, there's accuracy codes I use for elevation. It might have been identified also as a 20-1. But in any event, this procedure had a 20-1 penetration. Okay. Now, other items on here is your vertical descent angle, 3.75. And if you flew the 3.75 VDA, you're going to cross over that stack with about 98 feet of vertical clearance. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is, because the closer you get to the runway, the closer you're getting to the ground and all the obstacles. You get on, short final, you're 50 feet above the obstacles. But anyway, the procedure is designed to clear that obstacle, and you have 98 feet of vertical clearance if you're on the VDA. And I mentioned earlier, if anybody heard me, your actual, as the angles come together, you're obviously going to be closer and closer to obstacles. So this obstacle is 2,432 feet from the runway, actually 2,600 feet from the displaced threshold. And so it's that's about a half a mile, roughly, a little less than a half a mile, 0.46 of a statute mile from the threshold. So my point was, and like I said, I'm not sure how far I got into this. My point is that when you're operating below the MDA in the visual area, the pilot is responsible for visual identification and clearance from obstacles. And this descent angle, this advisory angle here, is only presented to provide for a stabilized approach. And because of the 21 to penetration, the FAA has instigated these notes on the procedure as per the guidance. The procedure's NA at night. There's no vertical descent point published on the approach, and the visibility has at least 1 statute mile. So the criteria is met to provide the pilot with a few tools to avoid flying into anything out there. But the main thing is, if you're flying the VDA, you're going to be okay. If you're flying at MDA until you have the runway identified, you're going to be okay. What I was saying, probably after I got cut off, it was very articulate and was very wide. But so the complicating factor here is the steam that comes off of this stack, and not just this stack, but there's about 4 stacks along here that generate a plume of steam. And the tendency, from my recollection, I've flown this approach quite a few times, is it's fairly narrow at the base, and then it spreads out up here, right over the final approach course. So it is a problem on this approach, but the rules, the guidance state that if at this point right here at MDA, if you don't see the runway, then you shouldn't continue below MDA. And my personal feeling is what happened was there was a bunch of steam right here, and the pilot tried to descend below it to where it was narrower so she could see the runway, and got too low and hit the stack. That's just my guesstimate. Like I said, there's actually another 20 to 1 penetration closer to the runway. It's the furthest inbound stack is probably the 20 to 1 penetrator that causes the approach to be the way it is. But nonetheless, it remains the responsibility of the pilot to visually acquire and avoid obstacles below the MDA during transition to landing. The NTSB came up with this probable cause in the report they issued yesterday. So the first sentence states, the probable cause of the accident is the pilot's failure to maintain altitude during an instrument approach, which resulted in a descent below the approach path and impact with the vent stack. So in my personal opinion, this is not the probable cause. The NTSB refers to the descent below the approach path. To me, the NTSB errs in specifying an approach path. There is no approach path or glide path on a non-precision approach. There is a vertical descent angle provided to allow for stabilized approaches. Some call it an advisory glide path that, again, does not provide any obstacle protection below MDA. So my probable cause of this, based on just looking at what happened here, is the pilot operated the aircraft below the published MDA and did not maintain visual clearance from obstacles. The main thing to remember is below MDA, you are flying a visual maneuver. So the bottom line, the pilot is primarily responsible for obstacle avoidance when flying below the published MDA. There are tools available to help provide obstacle avoidance. BGSI, such as PAPI or VASI, that will provide obstacle protection out to at least 4 miles, assuming it's unrestricted. The procedural safeguards that increase visibility minimums. There's a lighting of some obstacles, but not all obstacles. Some obstacles are unlit, including terrain, and the charting of some obstacles, which may or may not be on the chart, but at least it gives you an idea. And there's also tools that might sucker you into a false sense of security. An apparent glide path generated by your avionics suggesting a precision-like approach from the MDA to the threshold. So with that, a lot of stuff there that's going to be more pertinent to a IFR pilot, but it does raise some questions for the VFR pilot too, particularly flying at night. You really need to be careful. Personally speaking, I'd be reluctant to fly into an airport at night that I wasn't familiar with without a VGSI system working, and fly the published slope on the VGSI. But any questions or discussion items? There's a lot of material there.
So in that, there was the question about the displaced threshold of really a relatively small amount of, so does the instrument approach sort of respect a displaced thresholds that's been put in for any reason?
It does, but usually, I mean, displaced threshold is put in usually for some type of a noise abatement consideration or because of an obstacle on final. Or, I mean, as far as the FAA is concerned, you displace the threshold to deal with an obstacle. And it's mostly done on precision approaches, but it can also be done in this case. I would assume that it was done here for the obstacle problems. Any other questions?
Questions or comments for Scott?
Yeah, I think your chart helps explain it better than you did initially. And I didn't realize, but I asked the question, why did your graph line start, displaced from the threshold? And I just realized it was the 200 foot that you called out that the FAA designates as the distance that they start to measure that 20 to 1 or 34 to 1. So this helps a lot to describe what the environment looks like in the safe zone.
Okay.
So,
yeah, I went through those early ones I realized it's not gripping material, but I think it's important for pilots to understand in general, the basic line is below MDA, you're flying a visual maneuver.
if you stay on that same glide path to the touchdown zone, are you guaranteed, or will it keep you out of any obstacles?
No.
There's no guarantee.
The only protection you have, there's two things. One is if a VDA is published, well, that's the sucker part. If a VDA is not published, but you have a VDA on your avionics, that's a clue something's wrong. If the VDA is not on the chart, on the FAA chart, that means it's been removed on purpose by flight check. And then if that's the case, you'll have a note on there, visual segment obstacles. And that note is there because an FAA pilot evaluated the procedure and thought that the VDA got too close to obstacles when flying it properly. But there's no surface, there's no identification process for obstacles. And when these VDAs first came out, early on in the RNAV history world, there were cases where the VDA flew through trees. That was before the VDAs were even considered by the FAA. The avionics were putting on there. The companies that produced the databases were putting VDAs in the database in the avionics, thinking that that's going to stabilize an approach. And the FAA was not in the VDA business at that time. But in some cases with those VDAs, they would fly you through obstacles. So when the FAA realized that, they started getting into the VDA business, and that's the criteria that's resulted.
Yeah, thanks for putting, this is the best discussion I've ever seen about MDA, VDA. I have to tell you that.
No, appreciate it. Anything else? Then I'll turn it back over to the master.
There's no master here, but
There's no master.
I'm just a moderator here, and And I reflect that actually I've only been to Burley once. I tried to go twice. Once I landed VFR. I'm doing something cross country, I think in a 182. And I wanted to come back in at night. I was going from Sequim, Washington to Nashville, and I wanted to just stop at Burley to overnight. And I was, and when I got to Burley, all of the airport lights had gone out. Everything. I was on an IFR flight plan, and I actually had to ask ATC, did they know anything about the fact the entire airport was black? And they said, no, we don't know anything about it. So I ended up diverting to Pocatello. And I realized after your presentation, I had my guardian angel in the right seat that night, because that would have been enough IFR night approach probably into 2-0. And that could have been the last approach I ever did.
If you're flying the VDA and it's published on the approach plate, particularly on the FAA plate, I'm not sure what you do with the Jepson chart, but with the FAA plate, if it's a published VDA, then you can be fairly certain that flying the VDA will get you to the runway without hitting anything at night. But
I'm sorry, I'm not sophisticated enough to learn anything from your presentation other than when you go below the MDA at night, you're on your own, friend.
yes, you are on your own. The other thing is, of course, trees grow, and there could be obstacles that are higher than they were when they were surveyed. Sometimes 5 years occurs between surveys, as much as 3 years between flight checks. So you could have, the airport manager is supposed to be monitoring that stuff, but you get what you pay for sometimes. So it may or may not be monitoring it.
Okay, and on that, that seems like the perfect note to end our discussion this evening. And we will actually send out to the same distribution list once we get this video up on the EA 1541 website. So if you came late or had to leave, I guess if you left early, what I'm telling you means nothing. But anyway, we thank you for your participation, and hope to see you again next month. And fly safe, particularly at night below MDA.
Yep, there you go.
All right. Zoom wave.
Hey,
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
thanks, Dan.
See ya.
Thanks, Scott.